Good morning and apologies for the earlier technical hitch. Right, hello and welcome again to the October webinar from the IEA Clean Coal Centre. My name is Deborah Adams and I'm Communications Manager here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports which are available from our website www.iea-coal.org. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organisations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration. All the information you need for this is on our website. The webinar today is of great interest to many people. The subject is water availability and policies for the coal power sector. The presenter is my colleague Anne Carpenter. Her report on this topic has just been published and is available from our website. This report forms the first in a series on the various issues and concerns surrounding water and power generation. Now, if you have any questions during the talk, please use the Ask a Question box at the top of your screen. Add your email address as well so that Anne can send you a fuller answer should we run out of time. Okay, Anne, over to you.
Right, good morning everyone. Global energy demand is rising and meeting this growing demand is going to place increasing stress on limited water or freshwater resources with repercussions for other users in the agricultural, industrial and domestic sectors. Climate change could exacerbate the situation as water and climate cycles are inextricably linked. In this presentation, I'm going to examine the availability of fresh water for power generation, in particular for coal-fired power plants. I will begin by discussing global freshwater availability before showing where the water stress areas are in the world today. Then I will look at global water and energy demand. The water requirements of different power generation technologies will then be compared. Finally, I will discuss water availability in China and the USA and compare their water policies. The full report on which this webinar is based also covers India and South Africa. And this is the first report in the series I'm writing on water for power generation. Although 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water, most of it is salt. Only about 2.5% of the world's water is fresh. And of that, less than 1% is actually accessible via surface sources and through aquifers. The rest is locked up in glaciers and ice caps, or is deep underground. Fresh water is generally a renewable resource, but its availability is unevenly distributed across the planet. And this is due to differences in climatic patterns, geography, and human use. Moreover, the quantity and quality of available water varies over the year. So as a result, some regions will face more water constraints than others. As I mentioned earlier, global energy and water demand is growing, and this is principally due to the rising population and economic growth. The population is growing at about 80 million people per year, and is projected to reach over 9 billion by 2050. The majority of the population growth will be in the emerging and developing economies. This is shown in the blue area of this figure. Now, some of the developing countries are already facing water scarcity, stress, or some degree of vulnerability. As you can see this in this figure here. According to the United Nations, water stress occurs when water supplies drop below 1,700 cubic metres per person per year. Water scarcity is when there is less than 1,000 cubic metres per person per year. Now, as you see, China is classified as being vulnerable, whereas both India and South Africa are seen as water-stressed countries. In all three of these countries, coal is widely used for power generation. But even countries with seemingly ample water availability at a national level may face scarcity in particular regions, such as the southwest USA, which I'm thinking about seeing this figure. The figure is taken from the World Resources Institute's Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas. And here they classify water stress as the ratio of total withdrawals to total renewable supply in a given area. So So a high number means more water users are competing for limited supplies. And as you can see, significant areas of almost every continent are currently facing a high level of water stress. And these include large areas in India, China, Southern Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and the USA. Right, now globally, agriculture is the principal user of water. It accounts for about 70% of total water withdrawals. Industry, and this includes power generation, is the next largest user at 20%, and the domestic sector uses the remaining 10%. Now, these figures do vary considerably across countries. Industry is typically responsible for a higher proportion of fresh water withdrawal in developed countries, whereas agriculture dominates in emerging and developing economies. And this figure shows the OECD projections for global water demand as a function of fresh water withdrawals. It does exclude rain-fed agriculture. Overall, the OECD projects, this is in their baseline scenario, that global water demand will increase by 55% between 2000 and 2050. And within this, domestic sector water use will rise by some 130% and electricity use by about 140%. The biggest increase of all the sectors is the manufacturing, where water demand is projected to rise by 400%. So this is likely to be more competition for limited water resources. The bulk of the increase in water demand will occur in the BRICS countries, and these are Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, China and South Africa. And as I showed earlier, two of these countries, that is India and South Africa, already classified as suffering from water stress, and China is considerably vulnerable. Now, unless water demand and supply can be balanced, the world is going to face an increasingly severe deficit. A 40% water deficit by 2030 has been projected by the 2030 Water Resources Group, and this is in their business as usual scenario. Groundwater supplies are diminishing. About an estimated 20% of the world's aquifers have already been overexploited. And this has led to serious consequences such as land subsidence and saltwater intrusion into the coastal areas. Water quality is also deteriorating in some regions. And of course, the deterioration of wetlands worldwide is going to reduce the capacity of ecosystems to purify the water. Climate change can exacerbate the situation, as one of the consequences of rising temperatures is higher surface water temperatures, and this is going to decrease the efficiency of water-cooled systems in thermal power plants. Droughts and heat waves, combined with local water scarcities, have already interrupted electricity generation in a number of countries, with some serious economic consequences. Right, the Pali coal-fired power plant in India, for example, has been shut down since July this year because of water shortages. And of course, limitations of electricity available have affected the delivery of water services. Right, now I'm going to look at global energy demand, and in particular power generation demand and its associated water requirements. The IEA has projected a 35% increase in global energy demand between 2010 and 2035, with demand for electricity expanding by some 70%, and consequently an increase in water demand. This projection is in their new policy scenario, and this takes into account existing and planned government policies. Freshwater withdrawals for energy production, and this includes primary fuel production as well as power generation. This was about 583 billion cubic metres in 2010, or some 15% of the world's total freshwater withdrawals. And of this amount, water consumption was 66 billion cubic metres. Water consumption is the volume of water that is withdrawn and is not returned to the source. By 2035, energy-related water withdrawals are projected to increase by about 20%. And this is where China and India are going to account for about half of this growth. Consumption is rising by some 85%. And the increases are mainly due to changes in the power generation sector and by expanding biofuels production. If we look at water withdrawal for just power generation, this is projected to increase by some 4.5%, while consumption increases by almost 40%. And this is a result of a shift towards higher efficiency power plants with more advanced cooling systems, which withdraw less water but consume more per unit of electricity generating. How much water is required by a thermal power plant is mainly determined by the fuel type, plant efficiency, cooling system, and the prevailing meteorological conditions. It is the cooling system that largely determines how much water is actually needed. And these cooling systems can be divided into two broad categories, namely open loop and closed loop systems. And the closed loop systems can be further subdivided into wet and dry systems. Now, each of these systems will involve trade-offs in terms of water use, the impact on water quality, plant efficiency, as well, of course, as cost. Open loop or once loop systems withdraw large amounts of water and use it once to condense the steam exiting the turbine before returning most of it to the source. It's actually only a small fraction is actually consumed through evaporation. Therefore, most of the fresh water is available for use by the downstream users. However, the water is discharged at a higher temperature, and this can be detrimental to aquatic life and ecosystems. Power plants using these cooling systems are more exposed to fluctuations in water availability due to their high water withdrawal needs. Thus, they are vulnerable in times of water shortages. Right, on the other hand, wet closed-loop systems, which are also called recirculating systems, withdraw less water than the open-loop ones, as the heated water is cooled through the use of a wet tower or pond and is reused. Most of the withdrawn water is lost through evaporation, and consequently, the water consumption is higher than open-loop systems. But the lower water withdrawal rate does mean that it reduces the exposure to risks which can be posed by your limited water resources. But plant efficiency is lower than comparable plants with open-loop systems. Dry cooling systems use air instead of water as the cooling medium in the cooling tower, and so they're better suited to dry regions. But they are the least attractive economically, as they can cost about 3 to 4 times more to build than a wet closed-loop system. And of course, they also lower the overall plant efficiency by about 2 to 7 percentage points. And this can be even higher on a hot day. This is because air is a less efficient cooling medium than water. Actually, South Africa is a pioneer in the use of dry cooling systems. Right, this figure compares water withdrawal and consumption ranges per unit of electricity for a number of thermal power generation technologies which are fitted with different cooling systems. I just want to point out that fossil fuel and nuclear power plants with once-through cooling systems, which is shown at the bottom of this figure, they have the highest water withdrawals per unit of electricity generated, but they are amongst the lowest for water consumption. It's the combined gas plants which have the lowest water withdrawal and consumption rates among the thermal plants with similar types of cooling systems. The renewable technologies that use a cooling system, that is concentrated solar power, and the geothermal technologies shown near the top of this figure, they withdraw and consume similar or even higher amounts of water than fossil fuel and nuclear power plants with the same type of cooling system. It's the non-thermal renewables, such as wind and solar voltaic, that generally use minimal amounts of water, since they do not require a cooling system. Water, though, is still needed for maintenance, such as washing the solar photovoltaic panels. Right, now look at water availability in China and its energy and water policies in relation to power generation. China is actually the world's most populous country, with about 20% of the world's population. It's the second largest user of water and is responsible for some 14% of global freshwater withdrawals. However, it is the third driest country in the world. It only holds about of global freshwater resources. But the water resources are unevenly distributed across the country. In general, the southern region is water rich, whilst the northern and central regions are experiencing shortages. This is shown in the red areas in this figure. Unfortunately, most of China's heavy industry and agriculture are located in the north. Water scarcity has emerged as one of the most significant challenges to China's economic and social development. Water demand is growing, but supply is becoming increasingly limited. Groundwater now accounts for approximately 20% of China's total water consumption, but this increases to as much as 50 to 80% in the north and northwest. And over-extraction has led to raised salinity in the aquifers, land degradation, and a loss of agricultural productivity in the North China Plain. Also, water pollution is not helping the situation. About 30% of river water is considered to be unfit for agriculture and even for industrial use. A water deficit of some 200 billion cubic metres in 2030 has been projected by the 2030 Water Resources Group as in a business-as-usual scenario. Already 7 provinces and autonomous regions are running water deficits where water withdrawals exceed their renewable resources. And these include some of the coal-rich provinces. Right, China is by far the largest producer and consumer of coal in the world. In 2013, it accounted for just over half of global coal consumption. It is also the world's largest power generator. Some 78% of electricity was generated from coal in 2012. And the power sector is the second largest consumer of water. This is after agriculture. And in 2012, power generation accounted for some 10% of China's water. And of course, as I've mentioned, there's limited water availability in many of the coal-rich provinces. This figure shows where the main coal mines and coal-fired capacity are in relation to the water-stressed regions. This is drawn up by the World Resources Institute. Nearly 70% of the world coal capacity. Nearly 70% of the coal-fired power capacity and the majority of the coal mines are in medium to extremely high baseline water stress provinces. The medium stress areas are where about 20 to 40% of the available renewable water supply is withdrawn every year. And this number rises to over 80% in the extremely high stress regions. Now, the situation is likely to worsen with the building of new mines and power plants to meet the growing energy demand. More than half of the 363 planned coal-fired power plants, which identified in July 2012, are in high or extremely high baseline water stress areas. Right, now the IEA projects in its new policy scenario that water withdrawals for energy production will increase by 37% over the period 2010 to 2035 in China. Consumption, though, increases by almost 90%. And the majority of the energy-related water withdrawals is for power generation. So if we look at water withdrawals by just coal-fired power plants, these are projected to rise by 12%. And this is despite electricity output from coal-fired power plants increasing by about 65% over this period. And this is a result of the deployment of more efficient power plants and the use of wet cooling towers, which draw less water than open-loop ones. So, what is the Chinese government planning to do about this situation? Water security has certainly become one of the government's top priorities. The availability of water was a key factor in the planned restructuring of the country's energy mix. This table shows the planned increase in power capacity under the 12th five-year plan for energy development, which covers the period 2010 to 2015. China is certainly investing in more renewables. Solar capacity is planned to increase by nearly 25 times over this period, whereas wind capacity more than trebles. In the new 13th plan, the proportion of wind capacity is expected to double from the 100 gigawatts in 2015 to 200 gigawatts in 2020. And solar capacity will increase by some 5 times to over 100 gigawatts. As noted earlier, wind power consumes minimal amounts of water. The amount of water saved from solar power will depend on the technology employed. Nuclear capacity is also going to increase by nearly 4 times in the 12th five-year plan. But building some of these new nuclear power plants inland will require fresh water for cooling, and this could add to the pressure on water resources. Currently, all the nuclear power plants are on the coast in China and use seawater for cooling. However, coal is going to still remain the dominant energy source for some time to come. So another 300 gigawatts was to be added under the 12th plan. And this is partly due to energy security concerns. China has large coal reserves that it can use. The need to conserve water resources has been recognised by the Chinese government. Consequently, efficient water saving and other advanced technologies are mandated for new power plants. The majority of the new power plants will be either 600 or 1,000 megawatt supercritical or ultra-supercritical units. And these use some 15 to 20% less water than subcritical plants. The government also sees dry cooling as one way of relieving pressure on water resources. A number of policies have been issued since 2004 to promote dry cooling. And in some water-stressed regions, the local government has set compulsory requirements for new coal-fired power plants to install these systems. Right, to give you some idea of the water savings involved, the 1,000 megawatt supercritical dry-cooled unit at the Linghua power plant will use about 9,000 cubic metres of water a day, whereas a similar-sized conventional water-cooled plant would use nearly 3 times as much water. So the Chinese government is prepared to accept the lower thermal efficiency penalty which is associated with dry cooling. The national government is also promoting large-scale coal bases, which bring power plants and other large coal-related facilities near to coal mines. 14 large-scale coal production bases were planned, and most of these are in the water-stressed regions. But latest signs are that the national government is going to restrict the development of some of these bases. It's mainly those which just include the coal-to-chemical facilities that will not be built. A water allocation plan for the development of coal bases was issued by the Ministry of Water Resources in December 2013. The plan states that total water allocation for coal bases is to be taken seriously and that usage must be within provincial quotas. The national government had previously set water quotas for each province in order for China to meet the water use target set out in its 3 red lines policy. And this policy capped annual maximum water use, which is by everyone, to 635 billion cubic metres by 2015, 670 billion cubic metres by 2020, and 700 billion cubic metres by 2030. The water allocation plan does mean that coal power plants, mines and other projects are going to have to coordinate water utilisation. The need to use non-fresh water sources was acknowledged, and coal-fired power plants constructed in the north are being given priority access to mine drainage and recycled water. And the use of surface water is to be strictly controlled for the coal bases. And ground use water is prohibited except for that originating from mine drainage. The plan also specifies that water efficiency measures for coal-fired power plants with a first save and then use policy. And dry cooling and dry technologies among the technologies being promoted, especially for plants in water-scarce regions. Also, the annual water consumption of installed power capacity is to be reduced to 0.1 cubic metres per second per gigawatt hour. Sorry, just per gigawatt. Overall, the plan indicates that regional water availability will dictate coal development plans in the future and implies that water security is now more important than energy security. However, the government still needs to integrate its energy and water policies more fully, as some of its energy policy goals could conflict with the need to manage water resources more efficiently. Right, moving on to the USA. Again, I'll start with just a little background information. The USA is the world's third most populous country after China and India, and is the third largest water user in the world. As a whole, the USA is a relatively water-rich country with some 7% of the world's freshwater resources. Like China, water is unevenly distributed across the country. Water is generally more abundant in the northeast and northwest of the USA, whilst it's scarcer in the west and southwest. Agriculture is again the largest consumer of water, as is the case in China, India and South Africa. Thermal power generation actually accounts for about 45% of the nation's total water withdrawals, and this includes both fresh and saline water, and about 3% of overall consumption. Water availability is becoming an important issue, with the growing demand for water and energy and the increasing prevalence of droughts and heat waves in some parts of the country. Severe droughts have led to the temporary shutdown of some power plants. Water usage already exceeds availability in the west and southwest, which face growing water and electricity demand as the population increases. Some regions are already withdrawing more water from underground aquifers than is replenished. And even in the water-abundant northeast, the power generating industry faces issues of water quality and temperature. Here, power plants have had to close down at times to ensure they do not exceed the permitted water discharge temperature. And it has been projected that demand for water for the energy sector could outstrip sustainable supply by as much as 40% by 2030. Right, a report by the National Energy Technology Laboratory found that 347 coal-fired power plants, out of analysis set of 580 plants, these are located in areas which are subject to water stress, that is, with limited supply and or competing demand from other sectors. About a third of the vulnerable plants are actually situated in the southeast, and in this region thermal power plants account for more than 2/3 of water withdrawals. This figure shows the electricity mixes projected by the US Energy Information Administration in its reference scenario. Coal makes up a lower proportion of the electricity mix than in China. It is roughly half that of China's, and its proportion of the mix is projected to decline further by 2040, although it still remains the largest component. The share of nuclear power also declines. Increased capacity will be met by an increase in natural gas and renewables. And this is partly due to the expansion of shale gas production. Of course, shifting to combined cycle natural gas plants could result in significant water savings. The amount saved will depend on the cooling system used. As I pointed out earlier, combined cycle gas power plants typically withdraw and consume less water per megawatt hour than coal and nuclear power plants with the same cooling system. But of course the downside is that fracking the unconventional gas shales to produce natural gas is water intensive. It costs more water than a conventional gas well, so your water savings will be lower if the fracking needs are taken into account. The increase in the wind and solar power component of the renewables in electricity mix could also save water, although the amount saved will depend on the solar technology employed. Now, this projection does not take into account the effects of the proposed clean coal plan, which could substantially change the electricity mix and consequently water requirements. The introduction of the coal power plan and other proposed air pollution standards is likely to accelerate the retirement of older coal-fired power plants and discourage the building of new ones. Water usage in the power sector will therefore depend on the technology employed to meet the future electricity demand. Since the energy sector is the fastest growing water consumer in the USA, water implications of the energy policy will need to be closely considered so that a secure and sustainable supply of energy can be provided. Right, now I'll briefly compare water policy management in China and the USA. Water policy is managed differently in these two countries. In China, water is considered a national resource. Here, the central government acts as a custodian of the nation's surface and groundwater. It sets the nation's water policy, which is implemented by the states and local organisations. So the central government has the authority to regulate the allocation, flow and end use of all the nation's water. So consequently, changes in water policy and allocations can be more easily enforced. In the USA, the federal government has less control over water policy and its implementation. There is no overarching national water policy. Instead, there are a number of governance and policy structures at the federal and state local levels. This fragmented approach has created difficulties in managing the nation's water. Unlike China, there is no national, that is federal, water department, and many states have their own water policies. So in practice, the states have the most influence on managing and meeting the power sector's water demands, as they control the allocation of water resources. And the water allocation policies do vary between the states in the USA as well. Those in the East and West historically follow two different systems of water law. Water rights in the eastern states are based on land ownership, whereas water allocation in the western states is made on a first-come, first-served basis. Furthermore, groundwater rights are treated under a different system to surface water rights. Groundwater allocation is becoming increasingly complex as the states face growing concerns with depletion of aquifers. With energy's rising demand for water and the potential effects of climate change on its availability, good water management and planning is essential. Already, some states are only allowing new thermal power plants to install closed-loop cooling systems in order to reduce the freshwater withdrawal. Right, now to sum up. Meeting the growing energy demand is going to place increasing stress on limited freshwater resources with repercussions for other water users. Hence, multiple strategies are required across all sectors in order to meet the increasing demand for energy, whilst managing water resources more efficiently and sustainably. And this is going to involve governments making tough choices involving energy and water trade-offs in order to deliver a secure water and energy future. Countries are going to need to integrate their energy and water policies so that energy policies take into account water requirements, and conversely, your water policies should consider the energy implications. Energy and water policies have largely been developed in isolation from each other. In addition, the potential consequences of policies to mitigate climate change need to be taken into account. Some of the solutions favoured by governments to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, such as nuclear power and concentrated solar power, can be water intensive. But policy integration is beginning to happen. One barrier to greater integration is water data. Without good data on water resources, flows and use, it's going to be difficult for policymakers to assess and respond to energy and water trade-offs. Data on water quantity, quality and use are often outdated, limited, inconsistent or even unavailable. But it's not all gloomy news. There are a number of options available for reducing the water demand of thermal power generation. This includes the deployment of better technologies. As we've seen, government policy in China is to shift to more efficient coal-fired power plants and to use dry cooling systems in water-constrained areas. Significant volumes of water could also be saved by encouraging power plant operators to upgrade their cooling systems to less water-intensive ones. And water capture, recycling and reuse technologies within a power plant can also be adopted to conserve water. And many power plants already operate zero discharge systems, treating and recycling all their wastewater. Non-freshwater resources such as municipal wastewater and mine water could also be exploited by nearby power plants to relieve pressure on freshwater resources. And this is the topic of the next water report. So it just leaves me to thank you for listening and to say that the next webinar will be given by Paul on coal contracts and long-term supplies. And this will be on the 11th of November. Right, I'll just pass you back to Debo.
Hi, and thank you very much for a really thorough and interesting webinar presentation. While we check to see if any questions have come in, I've got one of my own, Anne. I'm not an expert on water and coal-fired power at all, but surely one answer might be to site power plants on the coast.
Well, this is already done with a number of power plants because they can use seawater for cooling, and even seawater can be used in flue gas desulfurization systems, which is another large water usage. And then they can use desalinization to produce the fresh water that they need to use. Now, desalination, though, it is energy intensive. You can integrate the desalination plant within the power plant by using the waste heat generated in the power plant to drive the desalinization process. And if you design your plant properly, you can produce more fresh water than is needed in the power plant. So the power plant could become a producer of both power and water for the surrounding areas.
Okay, thanks very much, Anne. Well, we'll give it another minute to see if any other questions come in, but just to remind you that Anne's PowerPoint will be available to download from the webinar page of our website later on today. And as she said, Paul Brewer will be giving the next webinar on Wednesday the 11th of November on his recent work on coal contracts and long-term supplies. If you do have any questions or comments for Anne now, as we're running out of time, drop her an email and she'll get back to you. And just a final reminder that this is the first report in a series that we're researching on water and coal together. So thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.